Welcome to the Dental Journeys podcast, brought to you by White Coat Financial. Whether you're a new grad or a seasoned dentist, we're here to share stories of dentists from across Canada, how they got to where they are today, and the strategies that helped them along the way. Plus, we bring in experts from outside of the dental world to share insights on the business and financial side of dentistry, helping you thrive beyond the clinic.
Awesome. So we are so thrilled to introduce our guest, Jackie, Chief Operating Officer and Representative with Roy Corp. As one of the main appraisers in the firm, Jackie has been personally involved in over 1,000 appraisals since joining Roy Corporation. She's primarily involved in appraising dental practices, but also has experience with chiropractic, optometry, and veterinary practices throughout Canada as well. And rather than us listing her exciting journey and achievements, we're going to hand it off to Jackie to give us a brief introduction of her journey into dental appraisals and sales. Jackie, how did you get into dentistry, and what did you do before this?
Well, first off, guys, thank you so much for inviting me on this. I realized the bio I sent you had a zero missing. I've been with Roy almost 11 years, so instead of 1,000, it's closer to like 10,000, which is great. It gives me such a great opportunity to see practices across the country, different markets, different locations. So prior to this, I've been in the dental industry almost 30 years. Before Roy, I was a healthcare banker. I had a team where we would finance and provide funds to purchasers who were looking to either buy or start up practices. I've just always loved the space. I just think it's such a great place to be. You get to hang out with a lot of nice people. Sometimes there's some really interesting characters, but you're always learning. I feel like I'm always learning things every day, and I'm just grateful for being part of this industry.
That's awesome. So, wow, I didn't even know there's that many practices for you to appraise that many.
Well, think about it. There's, you've got at least 20,000 dentists, and half of them will be owners, and we do them obviously for purchases and sales, but there are times that we do them for divorce. We do them if a dentist has been injured and they're making a claim for their insurance. Like, there's so many, and people use it as a financial planning tool, right? Because it is a significant part. And Gertrude, you're the expert there in that, but it potentially could be a significant part of a financial or an investment portfolio. And it's always good for people to know what their practice is worth, because sometimes they may think it's worth a lot more and not invest enough on one side, right? So, and then of course, when they sell, it may be worth a heck of a lot more, and then they need to decide what to do with those proceeds.
Yeah. And then sometimes it's just part of the planning. It's like, hey, I'm going to sell in 10 years or 5 years. Maybe I need to do, an estate freeze or something like that now.
Exactly.
So
yeah.
There's a lot of reasons for an appraisal. I think it's very common that people think I'm going to do an appraisal only when I'm selling, or when I've already made that decision to sell. But it's like, no, an appraisal happens several times over throughout the lifetime of your
client. That's just it. Exactly. For sure.
Awesome, Jack. So tell us more about Roy Corp itself, your involvement in it, and we kind of briefly discussed it, but sure. What's your involvement, and I guess how do you guys differ from other brokerages?
So first off, we are in our we've been doing this for 50 years. So we're the oldest brokerage in the country. Our founder, Roy Brown, was actually the gentleman that started this industry because he was an equipment supplier, and he would have friends that were getting ready to retire. And back then, dentists just kind of locked the door and left. So he said, no, there's value to your practices. And the industry was born. So we, as a firm, what makes us different, I think there's a lot of things that make us different. We have the most extensive reach in terms of attracting buyers. Buyers register with all the different brokerages. That's just a given. We do far more detail on the assets of a practice. So the attention to that detail often can mean a 10% difference in value. And it's the service. I like to call us the Mercedes of the industry. I mean, I always tell people, well, you can buy a Hyundai, you can buy a Mercedes. Why do you go towards the higher end car? assuming you can afford it. And it's the value of the service. It's the expertise that comes with it. Anybody can say that they can sell an office, but it's more than just selling it. It's getting it from the appraisal to the finish line, and it's even all the emotions, all the stress that's involved in getting it from start to finish is quite substantial. And even after it closes, we're still there to support all the parties. When the transaction happens. The other thing that we do is that we only work exclusively for the vendor. And that's really important because even though we provide a purchaser with all the information they need to make a good decision, and we're always very transparent, at the end of the day, the client that we serve is that vendor. And I always tell people, especially people who are thinking of selling, if someone in my industry comes to you and says, I have buyers for you, well, that should make you think as to, well, whose side are you really working for? Right? If you're going to let, say, an accountant or a lawyer or somebody else negotiate on behalf of their client, well, who's that person going to fight harder for? And that's what we always say, because we work for the vendor, no one will fight as hard for them as we would.
I'm actually glad you mentioned that, Jackie, because I think a lot of people think that, I'll just go to my lawyer or accountant and they'll sell my clinic for me to an existing client. And then you start wondering about conflict of interest and all of that. And it's funny because I'm typically on the other side of your transaction where you represent the seller.
Right.
I solely represent buyers.
Right.
Like all of my clients, when they're looking at an appraisal from Roy Corp or Three Tiers or Heaps and Doyle or whoever else is out there, even if it's just from like a lawyer, or an accountant, and they're doing a private sale, I always say to them, I do not work for the seller. I work for you. I'm going to be the one who's in there arguing, negotiating. I'm okay with being the bad guy.
Yep.
And normally I'm the least liked person in these negotiations because I'm telling both the seller and you guys, no, I don't agree with this. I think this is worth less and all of these things. But it's important because when you are selling or buying, I personally feel very strongly that you need to have someone who represents you, almost exactly the same as a real estate transaction. There is a selling agent and there is a buying agent. And so it's important that ROI Corp is representing only the seller, and that the dentist, whoever is buying, has that person. Hopefully someone who understands dentistry and the business, but hopefully someone that is acting in their sole interest.
100%. And I like what you said about, you're fighting for your client, because it's better for us to have those tough conversations, and because we can manage them. Whereas, and then when the time comes for the transaction to close and there's a transition required, it doesn't affect the two parties, because, you're going to go back to your client and tell them in a very delicate, nice way, no, I think this is what should happen. I'm not going to go back to my vendor and say, do you know what kind of a crackpot, so-and-so is, because they happen to get just a little too emotional at that moment. There's, we really want a buyer to have good advisors, because our industry is very different to real estate, like housing sales. Like, you'll have two agents, they'll split the commission. Because we're exclusive to the vendor, we don't share commissions, and that's just not us, that's any broker. So a buyer should be engaging an advisor and paying for their service, because then again, to your point, that it's very clear who's working for who in that sort of a situation. So, going back to what I do at Roy, I wear two hats. I have the role of the chief operating officer, where I am managing the internal team as well as managing our sales team. Obviously, Timothy Brown, who's our CEO and owner, he's very active and always that final decision maker. But that's one hat. The other hat I wear is I do have practices that I represent. So that's I'm licensed, and our title under the license has to be sales representative for legal purposes. But those are definitely the two hats that I wear at Roy.
Awesome. I like that you guys are talking about this, because as a buyer, as someone that's looking to buy myself, I think there is somewhat of a lack of buyer advocacy. So I don't know what other services you offer, but do you know, obviously this is something that he advises on as well, but most people kind of are it's a big purchase, obviously. It's one of the biggest purchases that you'll make, one of the biggest decisions you'll make.
Mm-hmm.
I find that most people kind of tend to lean on their banker, their lawyer, who I think see things from a different perspective. Bankers are kind of looking at it from, are you going to be able to pay us back kind of perspective. Lawyers, I don't know if they have the insights. I'm sure some of them do. But do you find that there is a lack of buyer advocacy in the market?
Um, I think it depends on the buyer, and I know that might sound vague. I always encourage buyers to make sure they're surrounded with people who know dentistry,
Mm,
because a dental lawyer, a dental accountant, they will understand the nuances that a regular commercial lawyer may not, or a regular accountant may not. So I think, and again, same thing with bankers. Like, are they a healthcare banker so they understand the financing of it, or are they, a personal banker that you meet in a branch that knows nothing about how a practice works or the value of the goodwill? I think what happens sometimes is, because it's such an emotional purchase. Um, there's so many people kind of like talking in the ear of that buyer that I don't even know if it's advocacy, to be very candid, because at the end of the day, they're making this decision, and it's really, what I like to see in a buyer is, are you confident? Do you feel good about what you're doing? Are you the right fit for this office? Like, if for example, the office has a very heavy Asian population that doesn't speak English, why is somebody who can only speak English and say from, I'm going to say, a Dutch background, because my husband is his family's Dutch. Like, why would somebody who has nothing in common with those patients? And that's what we always say about the value of an office. The value increases by the number of people who can step in to that practice. I mean, there's so many other factors, obviously, but you know, it's looking at, it's trying to understand how this person is really making their decision. And again, Gurtej, I'm sure you've had clients where it's the right fit. You think they'd be perfect for it, but whether it's parents, whether it's a spouse, whether it's an aunt or somebody who's like whispering negative thoughts in their heads, saying, "Well, I don't think you can do that. I don't think that's a good idea." Like, that's a whole different subject, I think.
It's funny that you mentioned that. I've always had the opposite issue.
Oh, okay.
I have always, so far in my career, almost always had clients want to buy. And like I said, I'm okay with being the bad guy with clients, that I'm like, I don't think you're the right fit for this
Mm.
clinic for exactly what you said. Very often, someone will go in. I had a client who was looking to buy a clinic, and the principal who was selling, their scope of practice was quite large. Like, they could do a lot of
Oh,
different
okay.
stuff.
Yeah.
And my client who was buying was pretty new. They like, I said, the day you take over this clinic, because the principal was leaving. There was no transition period. He wanted out. He had some situations with his family. He wanted out. So I said, you're going to take over this practice, and that number you're seeing on that top line of production is going to fall off a cliff because you can't do some of those treatments. And all of a sudden, like, no one was talking to the client about that. His dad was saying buy it. His accountant was saying buy it. His lawyer was saying, everyone was saying buy it. It's weird. I've actually had the opposite experience where I feel like I'm the bad guy going in, not because I'm actually the bad guy, because for me, I solely just want what's best for the client.
But
What is going to increase your net worth? That is my number
But
one
see,
thing. Are you going to be
that
wealthier?
makes me sad, because if that was my listing, and I know a lot of our team at Roy is the same philosophy. If that was our buyer looking at a particular practice and we knew it was a horrible fit, we would actually say to them, like, why are you doing this? Do you really think this is your best option? Or we would say, you know what, maybe look at something differently. But I had a funny story. This is when I was still a banker. I had this lovely young woman want to purchase a practice, and we'd never met in person until about a week before, when she came to me to get this loan. Long story short, she was Muslim and wore a hijab. She was buying the office of a Jewish doctor. So she's this 35-year-old young woman. He's this 70-year-old gentleman. And you always have to be politically correct. And I mean, maybe I'm even going down the incorrect rabbit hole at this moment, but I'm going to share it anyway. And I didn't know how to come out and ask her until I finally said, "How's this going to work?" Like, clearly you're from very different backgrounds. That's the way I got myself out of it. And she started to laugh. She goes, yeah, no kidding. I totally get what you mean. A, we're really good friends. And B, the patient base is heavy Asian. And so there's no issue. So I thought, okay, good. But at least, she went in there eyes wide open. And in fact, when I checked up on her a couple of years later, because at this point now I was at Roy, she'd grown that practice 30%. So
Wow.
that's an odd case, right? That's not the norm, but it still warranted the question. And she had her plan. She knew how it was going to work, and it worked out. It worked out very well for her.
It's good to know. I was actually curious with going back to sort of the original question here with the buyer advocacy. Obviously, I know I do a lot of that in my work. And frankly, I think most people, when they are buying an actual clinic, it's their accountant usually who handles that, or someone like me who's a wealth advisor. I only deal with dentists. And so very often I've seen so many clinics. I look through the appraisals, I read through them, and I see like, okay, where do I personally feel these numbers are a little inflated? Where are they overly aggressive, in my opinion? Where do I think that we're making assumptions that I don't think are really, rock solid? Because at the end of the day, everything's an assumption of the future. Right. And so very often I'm doing that, but it doesn't seem like there's not really anyone else doing that right now.
No.
Other than people's accountants. There's not a quote unquote Roy Corp or other firms who are doing that. Do you have any insight as to why that might be? Because there's a lot of brokerages who sell, but it doesn't seem like there's a brokerage who only does purchases.
I suspect, yeah. So, but that's part of the problem, because the brokers, we don't play well in the sandbox together. So if, we have our listings, so Roy, we have our listings. And if we had somebody, it goes back to who's paying who. Because if there's a purchaser that, like I understand the value that you bring to the table. You're their wealth advisor. You're trying to help them make good informed decisions. I presume your payment comes as a result of making good investment decisions with them and being that trusted advisor. So it just makes sense. And then the referrals grow from there. But if you were, say, a true real estate agent, forget you do what you do. You were a real estate agent and you came to me and said, I have a client who wants to buy this office and I want you to pay me. Well, I'm not going to pay that agent. So now how does your time get compensated? And unless your buyer is willing to pay you for your services, that's where the problem lies. And I think a lot of the brokerages, us included, feel that as important as advisors are, every time I speak to students or new grads, I always say, make sure you register on all the brokers' websites, because then, you're going to know what's for sale. So we all know that people are there and are available. It's just, again, having that solid having that solid advisor that is truly helping them. I mean, you would think if they've chosen a good lawyer who's a dental lawyer who understands these practices and the nuances, that advisor could be there. But again, a lawyer has to be a lawyer. So they're going to say, well, I can't tell you to do this. I can only tell you whether this is good or this is bad. So I think the fact that you're taking that time with somebody is really good for them.
There you go, Gertej. That's your thing now. There's a market for it.
It's funny. It's turned into a market because I think Ricky and I were chatting about this, where I was like, the financial planning side of things, I feel very confident with. It's easy. I get it. It's kind of rinse and repeat. Where most of my time these days is spent is being a buyer advocate, so to speak. But it's funny because there isn't really a way to be compensated for it. A lot of the times I will do all the due diligence and then the sale doesn't go through because of a million reasons how a sale. I'm sure Jackie knows exactly the million reasons why a sale would fall apart, and then it falls apart, and then we restart the process. And I was like, I just put in 15 hours into being your advocate. Now, are you going to pay me for that? Or how are we going to compensate for it? And if anything, I'm even working through that business model right now, almost through trial and error of having done this so many times. But it makes a lot of sense because no one's ever really said it to me that way.
And
Of there isn't really a buyer advocate, because who is going to be compensated for that time and solely do that, when really, when you're selling, it's a lot more concrete. You only get paid from a percentage of the sale when the sale happens. And you kind of do the work once, you do the appraisal. And frankly, in today's market, the clinic will sell. It's not like you're going to have to do 5 appraisals for it
oh,
to sell.
hold on. No, it's not that easy. You know, it's funny because when I was the banker and I would see these appraisals and I would finance them, I would think, why do you even need a broker? This is like shooting fish in a barrel. And I'm talking 11 years ago. And when I came to Roy and I saw what it was involved to get that vendor across the finish line, that was one thing. This last year has been this has been the toughest year because interest rates are completely freaking people out. So it's not uncommon for a practice that would have sold in like 90 days a couple of years ago. We're now at 8 months later, and I'm dealing with one right now where it's there's 2 points on there that could cause it to blow up. And and then when you think of it taking so much longer, we are updating the appraisal. There is a lot of there's a lot of work that people don't realize, because I had one listing. I literally brought that vendor 8 offers over the course of a 6-month period, and each one of them blew up. Half of them blew up because of the vendor, quite frankly. But I never got paid on that deal. So we're kind of in the same boat. But I think what I like about what you do, Gurjit, is that it's a value add. It's showing it's showing the people you work with. I'm not just an order taker. I'm a holistic solution, because I'm looking at everything that would be of importance to you.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know what? You're absolutely right. I didn't mean to say that it just sells easily. I know exactly how, because I've been involved and I was like, there's a million things that could go wrong. We have an accepted offer. That doesn't really mean anything.
Yeah.
I tell my clients, I'm like, it doesn't mean anything until you are the
Money's
owner
in the
and you are
bank.
literally in the chair practicing dentistry.
Exactly.
And when all the money is done and it's out of escrow or out of trust and the funds are deposited, that's when the sale is done. It doesn't mean anything when we have an accepted offer until that process is done. And I think it's also important that you mentioned that, yes, you do actually have to update your appraisal while you're going through the sale if it doesn't close very quickly, because not just because of the environment, interest rates, market, and all that stuff, you could end up having a new fiscal year pass. It's not sometimes based on the calendar year. And so now those financials need to be updated because we have new fiscal numbers to report. And that's where I think you, as the representative of the vendor, probably need to communicate a lot with the accountant as well of, okay, we are selling this practice. We need to actually show the true numbers of this clinic. Because I could say this from my end. My clients were writing off all sorts of stuff that's not really part of the clinic.
Well, that should be
right. And so we need to show the true numbers. Do you have that conversation then with the accountants of structuring those financials in a positive manner?
Oh, we do not sign off on any appraisal until we are convinced of what those add backs look like. Because again, banks rely on our appraisals to lend the money. Whether we broker the deal or it's a private deal, they're coming back to us to, have their comfort letter as part of their security package. But there's a lot, like when we do an appraisal, people think, oh, I can have it done like in a week or 2. Yeah, you could, but it's not going to be a good document. Like we take a good solid 4 weeks to give you a draft for us to review with you, because we want to make sure we captured everything. And even to your point, like you could start the appraisal today and you've got a hygienist working for you for $40 an hour, and that's what it's been. And then suddenly 6 months from now, that person leaves and you're replacing him or her with a hygienist at $60 an hour, which has, again, an impact on that bottom line. So there's just so many, like you're not going to update it if you get your deal done quickly, but if it's something that's taking anywhere from 8 months to 12 months kind of thing, it will need updating for sure.
Awesome. I'm gonna take this back a little bit here. So I'm gonna get you guys kind of play a scenario, I guess, as a first time buyer, and and you guys have the insights on the other end. What are the timelines like with all this? So, say Jackie, I look at one of your listings, I'm interested in it. Is there anything that I should have done beforehand? To contact the banks, contact with lawyers, and then what is the timeline of, I'm interested in this. Where do we go from here?
So typically what happens is when we launch a practice in the market, if you're on our list, you'll get a notice saying we have this new um, practice available. And it'll have basic information in it. Like it'll tell you what the gross is. It'll give you how many ops, what's happening in there. It's not enough information for you to figure out whose office it is, but it's enough to pique your curiosity. So then you contact whoever's running with the listing, and you, depending on the size of the practice, you might get a one pager, you might get a booklet. It depends. Again, you're still not going to know whose office it is. And then at that point, if everything looks reasonable to you on the surface, then you decide if you want to attend the open. And the open is usually about 10 days after after we make the announcement that this practice is available. So then you book an appointment, you see the practice. One thing I would really love to tell buyers is if you're not going to show up, please call us and tell us you're not going to show, because it's just courtesy. Same thing is if you call us, you show interest, and then we follow up and you ghost us. Come on, guys, that's not cool. Like simple text, sorry, not interested. That's all anybody deserves to receive. Anyway, you come and see the practice this Sunday, let's say. And more than likely, we're going to have about a 10 business day deadline for you to present an offer. It's a conditional offer. It's conditional upon key things like financing, due diligence, lawyer review, which is basically the ability for a buyer and a vendor to agree on purchase price and terms and conditions without getting a lawyer involved. Not that we would ever stop you. You want to take it to the lawyer, take it. But this just saves you a little bit of money if you can't make a deal happen. And lawyer review allows both parties then, if a deal is reached, to put clauses in there to protect the other side, kind of thing.
Jackie, I'm going to stop you there. Actually, with this offer, what are you looking for? Is it like a number? Is it like a letter of interest kind of thing?
So when you make the offer, so let's say the practice, we've appraised it at $1 million, the asking price is $1 million. Then you decide what is comfortable for you. If you visited the office, you like what it looks like, you see the opportunity in it. So again, our appraisals are based on historical. We don't put future potential in there. We want to show what's the facts and what's been happening. So if everything ticks the boxes for you, or at least 75% ticks the boxes, that's what I tell people to have as their minimum, then you make an offer of $1 million. If let's say that this particular vendor refers out 20 procedures a month, and they're all procedures that you can do, and it's a very attractive office, you might, I'm not saying that you should, but you might decide, you know what, I'm willing to pay $1.1 million for that. I'm willing to pay a premium because I can do all the stuff that they're referring out. So you might feel, I don't want to spend more than 800. But what I do tell buyers is go in with your best offer, because you don't want to be in a situation where you find out, oh, I didn't get the practice and I would have gone up another 50 or 75,000. Just do your best offer if you believe in the office. And so that is generally about 2 weeks. It's hard for a bank to pre-approve you, because again, it's not like a house where it's a very fixed amount. Because again, it goes back to, a banker might lend you $1 million today on this practice, but tomorrow the practice that you want to buy might be the absolute worst option for you, and you might have nothing in common with that vendor, and you don't speak the language of the patients, so nobody's going to lend you anything for that. So, I think it's just knowing who the right people are to have a connection to a healthcare banker, have a connection to a dental lawyer, and an accountant. Like, just make sure that you have, and if it's a cortege in your life, like have your team. That's what you really should be having. And then if your offer gets accepted, then, because offers have to come with deposits. Usually the deposit can be made within 48 hours after that. We like to have people provide a 10% offer, but sometimes the practice value is too high to warrant, like, for someone to have access to that. So, bottom line is, if you're buying a practice for $2 million, putting down a $5,000 deposit isn't going to cut it, because it's got to be meaningful, right? And then the clock starts to tick. You have conditions to fulfill. Like I said, due diligence, financing, assignment of the lease. If you want the owner to stay, you're going to have an associate agreement. We tell people don't get too detailed in the offer, from the aspect, I want the vendor to work 3 days a week at 40% less lab, like just say mutually acceptable associate agreement. So once that gets signed off, realistically, you should expect to close within 90 days. But that can change too, because maybe the associateship you're in wants you to give 60 days notice, and you're not going to give 60 days notice until all your conditions are waived. So like it just really depends.
Yeah. And then is that deposit, I guess it's a non-refundable kind of thing, or
Well, it's refundable if the conditions can't be met. So if you can't get financing, that's a failure of a condition. You might get approved for financing, but if the landlord won't assign you the lease, then there's another point. Sometimes people don't realize, like, they're afraid to waive financing, they're afraid to waive due diligence, even though they're in a position to do it. There's still so many opportunities, unfortunately, for a deal to go sideways. Like, you might not agree on something in a purchase and sale, in the actual agreement itself.
Gotcha. That makes sense.
I've wondered about this, because not everyone is what's the word, very open that they're selling their clinic.
Yeah.
As a principal, like if I'm retiring, my staff kind of knows, okay, gentleman's going to be retiring, whatever, and they're kind of aware that they'll be an owner. But let's say I'm going through, God forbid, a divorce, or I'm sick, or maybe I decided there's more to life than work and I want to sell my clinic. Is there a way of ever selling a clinic discreetly through a brokerage?
That's the only way.
Because I know a lot of private sales happen, quote unquote, discreetly, and everything's agreed upon before the staff even knows, which I don't recommend anyone do. You should let your staff know. But with a brokerage, is there ever a way to do this in a quieter, more efficient way without an open house? Is that even a possibility, or no?
Well, our whole mantra is to do this very discreetly and privately. When we do an open, we do it on a Sunday when the clinic is closed. You have to be a good broker and be ready that if for some reason a staff member unexpectedly pops in, which that has happened to me. So I've quickly pivoted and said, oh, Dr. So-and-so was kind enough to let me borrow the clinic today to interview associates in the area. Did he not tell you that? And then it kind of diffuses it. We definitely work on the discreetness and the privacy, because even if the doctor's old enough to, like, it's not hard to see when someone's like in their, like, say 70 and the gray hairs, their staff know it's coming. But when that final day shows up, they don't know. And we always tell our vendors, let's just keep it quiet until we know all the conditions, because it's not even that you're afraid somebody finds out. It's what's the stress this puts on the staff, because today they think it's for sale and then it doesn't work out. Then what happens? So it's just best to leave it all on the QT until the conditions are waived and we're working towards that closing date, full steam ahead.
Gotcha. So I know we've been talking about acquisitions right now, and it's funny how you were mentioning the market's kind of been maybe somewhat down compared to a year or two ago. Maybe the sales aren't as frequent. They're taking a little bit longer, similar to real estate, I guess, as well. What are, like, startups can cost, up to $1 million now, sometimes even more. And, looking at appraisals, some of the practices are actually less than that, and they're established and they have somewhat of a patient base. Maybe you might be a little bit biased in terms of acquisitions, but what are your thoughts on startups versus acquisitions?
I don't understand why people are still starting up in the GTA. If you're in a small town and, like, there's the next dentist is 50 kilometers away, go for it. But everyone wants to stay in the GTA. Everyone, there's still so many startups in the GTA. And unless you're really built to do what you need to do to go out there and market and attract the patients and, put all your time and effort. I mean, Ricky, you said it. Most of these clinics take about $1 million. Everyone thinks that they're going to do it for 700, and then overruns start to happen, and then they'd rather have the sliding pocket door rather than no door, and all these little things that quickly add up. But then they also don't realize that for the first 18 months they're not even breaking even. So
Mhm.
it's not a million, it's more like a million two, because you have to pay rent, you have to pay somebody to answer the phone, like there's just general expenses. So I always encourage people to do warm starts, because a warm start is a clinic where the vendor has done all the heavy lifting, and as you said, it's oftentimes less, which it is, less than the cost of starting up, and you've already got that base. So those to me are tremendous opportunities, and they go through cycles. Like right now, they're more popular. 5 years ago they were really tough ones to get across the finish line. Sometimes they're harder on the vendor than they are on the seller, on the purchaser, because as a vendor, you might have paid 700 to build that clinic, but yet we are giving all those assets a value of 500. And the first thing you're going to say is, well, that's crazy. But we don't give value to labor. We don't include HST. We don't include drawings and permits and all the soft costs that are involved in getting that clinic open. We can only give value to the hardcore asset that is physically there. So, sometimes that is a harder pill for a vendor to swallow. But again, I always tell people, if you want to sell it, you have to look at the cost analysis, the cost benefit analysis. Like maybe this is causing you a ton of stress. If you're feeling sick because you can't make this work, or you've decided it's better for you to be an associate, then those are reasons why there's no shame in selling that clinic. But I'm not keen on startups. I haven't been keen on startups because again, I'm an ex-banker. I understand the concept of repaying loans. And I just think that you better be built to be an entrepreneur and do what it takes to start it up. And everyone says they are, but not a lot of people really are.
Yeah, I think
I think I'd second that.
yeah, to jump on your point, I think one of the main things from a buyer's perspective is if you're buying one of these warm start, and it makes sense. The warm start makes sense, and especially if you know what you're in for and what you're doing. I think one of the main things that maybe scares them is that why hasn't it worked with this
That's right.
individual? I guess that would be the main thing. But I think if you know what you're doing and you know what you can kind of add in that sense, then it definitely does make sense.
Yep.
Yeah, just to add or piggyback to that, I think for me, anytime one of my clients wants to do a cold start, I wouldn't go as far as saying I don't understand why people are. I get why they're
I
doing
do too.
it, but I think it takes a special person to go through the stress and the waiting and the permits and the things going wrong,
Yeah.
and you open up a wall and there's something behind there that no one knew about, and it takes a very different type of person who I believe has a very strong conviction of wanting to build their clinic their way, the way they had envisioned it, and have every little feature customized. It very much is similar to buying a house in that respect. Why would you go and build a property from scratch and make every little decision when you could just buy a place that's already there that is the perfect home? But that's where that differentiation comes in on personality,
So
what it is that you want,
that's a
how
good point.
involved in the
Yeah.
process do you want to be.
Yeah.
But it's super tough in markets like the GTA or even the GVA, where dentistry is so dense. Like I go to the gym, just for example, there is 6 dental clinics in that one complex.
Yeah.
One complex has 6. So it's like, why would you ever start something from scratch here?
Yeah.
So I totally get where Jackie's
But
coming from
it's
there.
funny you
But
say
with
that.
the
It's funny you say that. I guess the reason I said, why would you do it? So going back to my comment about if a clinic that somebody sees has 75% of what they're looking for, I would encourage them to buy it, because, to your point, Gurtej, you can make that clinic yours. We always tell a buyer, don't change a thing for 6 months to a year. Just get your feet, solidly planted, understand how this clinic works. But like, if I think of my house, I won't bore you with a quick tour, but I remember we bought our house, my husband and I bought it 23 years ago, and we renovated it when it wasn't a popular time to renovate, right? Like, and I remember the contractor said to us, what the hell is wrong with you two? Why didn't you just buy a house a newer house? But where we're located, I mean, my backyard is the ravine. Behind the ravine is the lake. Like, there was so many things we loved about the house, that we thought, well, make it ours. We can make it the way we want it to be. So, I think what's really important is people just have to know what they're comfortable with. And if you are the type of person that has the grit to handle starting up from scratch, um, you know, doing aggressive marketing, because that is what it takes to bring patients in the door, to be there, because that's the other problem. People will start an office, but they need to live. So they work as an associate 2 or 3 days somewhere else. Well, it's really hard to be a business owner and be there part-time when you've got full-time bills.
Yeah, yeah, that is definitely one of the toughest things. It kind of, just to jump ship a little bit, in terms of appraisals, and kind of looking at it from a buyer's perspective, what are some things that how do you guys value like a practice essentially? I know, people talk about EBITDA and all that.
Yeah.
And you were just mentioning that you base it kind of on
Performance.
past income
Yeah.
statements and performance, and
So
how do you guys go about that?
So we
And
do what's
what are
called
things?
a cash earnings method. And what that means is, so we value assets as assets. We go in, we count plugs, lights, we measure, we record serial numbers. That's why if you see one of our appraisals, just the asset section alone is quite substantial. Then we take a 3 to 5 years of financial statements. We take, again, production reports, collection reports, because we want to make sure that all of those match up to the financials. We normalize it. And then but what I mean by cash earnings is we want to value a practice based on what that practice produces before a dentist is paid. And obviously, we know you need a dentist to do the dentistry, but a dentist is often says, well, how much am I going to be left with after I pay everything, including the bank? And so when you look at one of our appraisals, we have a cash flow page after all the analysis that says, okay, if you bought this office and the cash earnings for the existing owner are 300,000, for example. And after you buy this office and you factor in the annual loan payment and interest and all the expenses, if you're left with 100,000 before a dentist is paid, me as a business person, if I was allowed to buy that office, I wouldn't buy it because I can't control the dentistry. I have to pay a dentist, so I'm likely going to be in the hole. But as a dentist, if you're buying this for yourself and you're building equity for yourself, you might actually buy that, because even though it's 100,000 and you're making less as a dentist, if the bank is giving you 100% financing, you've now bought a business that you're building equity for yourself, that you can then turn around 10, 15, 20 years from now, and you're going to sell it as well. So that's another key component. Obviously, numbers are cash is king. And then the final component to ours is we have a set of 19 criteria that we give a dentist a plus or a minus on, depending on how they've answered our questions, depending on very specific things. So I'll give you a quick example. A lease. If you own the property, you're going to get the maximum positive adjustment for that, because you're not dealing with a landlord. You have no issues of demolition clauses, relocation clauses, crazy renewals and terms and whatnot. However, you might be in a building, you might be leasing, and there is a demolition clause that can be triggered at any time. That's going to have a major negative impact on value. Same thing like the concentration of patients the example I gave before. If it's a very heavily ethnic practice, that's going to have a negative penalty because it reduces the amount of people who can come in and take over. So there's so many criteria that we use, and that's how, when you look at our appraisals, you'll see there's a very specific amount for equipment, for leaseholds, and then there's a very specific amount for goodwill. So that's how we do it.
Gotcha. Yeah, and I've looked at your guys' appraisals. They're nice and detailed. If anyone hasn't registered, you guys definitely should register. Just to, I think it's important to kind of be aware of how things are valued, how things are appraised.
But if I can add to it, appraisals are very intimidating documents, because when I was the banker and someone would come in and ask me, I want to buy this practice, I actually would say, do you know what you're reading? Because it's so much information, it can be overwhelming. So I always tell, even when I'm selling the practice, especially somebody who's never owned before or it's going to be something that they're working full time and it's their first practice, I always, first of all, I take them to the numbers. Does this make sense for you? Then I take them to we have a summary of the procedure codes that are happening in there. Can you do this? Like if the practice is a basic restorative office, fantastic. Anybody can walk in there. But if 20% of the revenue is implants and you can't do implants, or it's ortho with Invisalign and you don't do Invisalign, then that needs to make you think. Now, our value will take that into consideration. So the value is going to be a little less on those types of practices than a true GP office. But the fact is, it doesn't matter what the price tag is. Are you going to be able to duplicate the work that the vendor does? Right. So I always get them to look at that. And then I get them to look at the hygiene. I like to see hygiene at 30%, but there's lots of times where hygiene's 18%. That doesn't mean the patients wouldn't be compliant. That's just the philosophy of that owner to take that $1,500 worth of insurance and apply it to dentistry versus carving out a piece for hygiene. I tell people, look at what's referred out. That's where your opportunity is, because if you can take this practice and keep the endos or keep the Invisalign that's being referred at, whatever it is, there's your opportunity, to grow the practice further. In addition to what are you going to do differently as the owner to attract more new patients?
I think the tough thing too becomes where Jackie and her team are, creating these appraisal reports. And sometimes they're very long documents, 50 documents, 50 pages or something like that. And then someone like me goes in there and I say, well, I don't know if I agree with this, or inevitably everyone's going to have their take on what something is worth, because it's as much as Jackie and I could do the math behind something, because we can both look at the same income statement and come up with a different evidence, technically, based on how someone does it. That's just the nature of accounting and finance. Everyone could look at a business. Same thing. It doesn't just apply to dentistry. This could be, someone could look at Apple, the company, and Warren Buffett might think it's worth, X dollars, and someone else might think it's worth X dollars. At the end of the day, only time tells who's really true. But really, I always tell clients, as much as we do the mental gymnastics, things are worth what someone is willing to pay.
I'm glad you said that. Yeah.
And that's the fundamental nature of it. I will look at a clinic and I will look at who the buyer is and say, yes, this buyer maybe shouldn't buy this clinic for more than, let's say, $1 million.
Yeah.
But I might have another client who can do those treatments, and sure, maybe they can pay 1.1 for something, because that extra cash that they're going to put in, they're going to make back in X number of years. But 100%. Then someone else might look at the clinic and be like, oh, well, I would only pay $900 for it. At the end of the day, something is worth what someone is willing to pay for it. But I think that's where that inevitable back and forth is going to happen during that negotiation process. I would say my question here is, I found it very frustrating, where I felt like, obviously, and again, you can tell me your takes on this, I feel very much that we're in a seller market. Because if I look at a clinic and I tell my client, hey, I wouldn't pay $1 million for this, we know that we're going to maybe walk away from that sale. And I'll always tell my client, there's going to be someone down, who's also going to put an offer, and they'll probably buy it for the price that we said it's not worth. How do you deal with setting those expectations with your clients? Because I'm noticing I'm going in and we're not buying something for X amount of dollars, but then someone else will go and buy it. We found it very frustrating. Do you think we'll continue being in sort of a seller's market in dentistry, or do you think things will change?
I think it's a seller's market just because of the number of practices available to the number of buyers that are available. But a seller's market doesn't mean, and I'm glad you brought the point up about value, because I always tell people there's two values. There's the value that I place on something as an appraiser, and then there's the value that the market dictates. And the market value is what a buyer and a seller have agreed to. So if it's more or if it's less than my appraised value, it doesn't mean I was wrong. It's just that's what these two parties agreed to. So in terms of a seller, even though it's a seller's market, a good broker will help set expectations for their vendor, meaning in something that is at a 7.2% interest rate, you need to be prepared. I mean, ideally, I would love to get you multiple offers. But you also have to accept the fact that here's a couple of things that may cause someone indigestion in your practice, and it may cause them to offer you 5% less than the appraised. And I always go back to the big question is, why are you selling? If you're tired, if you're fed up of things, you don't want to deal with staff anymore, you don't want to deal with this new government program that's coming in, there's so many things that are bothering you, then as long as you're not giving away the practice, then fine. Like it's not a sign of defeat to take something a little bit less than appraised. But if you don't have to sell, you just want to try it out, then don't settle. Like and I always encourage buyers to put in offers that are reasonable, because maybe my vendor needs to see one or two offers below the appraised to realize, okay, maybe this is what I have to think. For sure, a practice that has like a 40% hygiene program, that has really good terms and renewals, no demolition, lots of procedures being referred out, the likelihood of that one getting a premium is quite high, right? But if there's some of those other factors that everything's being kept in house, there's high cost staff, like the lease is expensive and it's coming up for the next term to be exercised, but it's probably going to go up. Like there's so many factors that might affect why someone chooses to offer what they offer.
I think it's really interesting where you mentioned that with those clinics, because I've noticed the same. The clinics that refer a lot of procedures out, they of course, if I'm a buyer, if I'm representing a buyer, I'm like frothing at the mouth when I look at something like that, because I'm saying, well, look, we can add this much value here. You could do this many more procedures. I've actually had a lot of clients who are specialists buying general specialty clinics, because they're like, I could throw an associate in there and then I could just buy myself this referral source. And I see that quite a bit. A lot of my clients are doing that, especially if someone's already referring out. Where I found it tough is I will look at an appraisal, and someone who is doing everything in-house, their EBITDA number is going to look very good because they're doing a lot of production. But when I look at that clinic, I'm like, well, I don't see a lot of upside here, because when they're already at the peak of their, in my opinion, earning potential. You're looking at a really great dentist who's doing a ton of different procedures, very wide scope of practice. Their EBITDA number looks great based on previous performance. But then I start worrying about, what's this clinic going to do in the future? How many, who is that buyer pool going to be? Have you noticed that affecting the actual appraisal? Because then you're as a buyer, you're in a catch-22. You're like, okay, if I'm looking at a clinic that is doing everything in-house, the EBITDA number is really high, and therefore the valuation is really high. But if I'm looking at a clinic where they're referring everything out, sure, the EBITDA number might be lower, but now all the other buyers are looking at this and saying, I want to buy it for really high. How do you balance that out?
It's a hard question to answer. So first of all, we are always dead against EBITDA, because we don't feel it takes into account all the nuances that our cash earnings methodology does. But I don't have any logical answer for you, because I'd say 50% of what goes into someone's offer is their emotion. And if they really like what they see, then they go ahead and they offer whatever they think, whether it's logical or there are times I look at the offer that comes in, and Tim and I will say, oh my God, there's 5 offers, and they range anywhere from $100,000 to $500,000 above our appraised. Like, what the heck is going on, right? And you can say, yes, there's all these procedures referred out, the hygiene's 40, there's all these positives, but you're still paying $500,000 more. And it comes down to the sustainability of it. Will you be able to, you better be sure that you can take this up to where you need to. And then on the flip side, we always tell the vendors, if you're really referring this many procedures out, you better show it in your chart somewhere, because when due diligence happens, if we cannot verify that you're sending out 10 ortho patients a month, then somebody's going to have an idea of, maybe I'm going to change the offer price, because I was offering this based on these referrals, and you can't show me where they go. How do I know it really happens?
Yeah.
I actually had a question for both of you. How do you guys feel? I guess Jackie, for you as someone who is a seller, and then Ricky, you as someone who's a potential buyer. I'll give you guys my 2 cents on it after. How do you guys feel about 100% financing with banks? Because I've always struggled with that as someone who also used to be a banker and now is a wealth advisor. I feel like it's a little bit like a situation where, you know how with government, like student loans, the reason education has gone up so much is because everyone was guaranteed financing to go. And so now the university market gets to operate in a bit of a vacuum where they have buyers who have unlimited funds because the government's going to back it. I've personally felt like dentistry's gone through a similar thing because we did say things are worth what someone is willing to buy them for. But the underlying assumption of that is things are worth what people are willing to pay for it. And what people are willing to pay for it is
What they
usually what
get
people can
financing
borrow
for.
for it.
Yeah.
And so I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this, Jackie, because obviously you represent the seller. The higher that sale price, the better the value. You know, the more ROI Corp makes Roy Corp makes as money. But objectively, how do you feel about the financing? Do you think there's a better way of doing things? Like even if it was like a 5% down payment, would that cool the market a bit or make it a little more fair?
I don't know.
What are your
I
thoughts
don't know
there?
what
And then
will cool.
Ricky, you can follow up.
I don't know
with that.
what will cool this market because if COVID didn't cool it, and you know, even though we're talking about a prime rate of 7.2, we still sell. Like we've still been selling. We haven't lost momentum in the sense that, you know, we haven't completed a sale all year kind of thing. Like we've got that happening. So I feel 100%. So I was in the banking system back in 92 when the banks came out with this program, and it was designed to allow a young dentist to buy a business, work it for 20 years, and then retire. So in principle, like from that aspect, I think it's fine. I think that it's great. Like, you know, people have spent a lot of money on their education. They might still have some student debt left over. This is their way to build their future. Do I think if you can afford to put some money down, you should? For sure, especially when you're getting charged 7.2% on a loan. Where I feel sometimes it's dangerous is when a lender tells me we're prepared to do 115% of the appraised value. So now instead of, you know, lending that appraised, you're giving them even more money. And that's all fine and dandy when you're giving 2 years of interest only payments. But, you know, when you're in an economic environment like today, where the clinic was bought 2 years ago when prime was 2.5%, and now payments are kicking in and it's no longer a 12-year loan. It's really now being paid over 10 years because you've had 2 years of interest only. Was this really the right thing to do? Probably not. I don't think so. But again, you know, where do you put the onus? The bank looks at the appraisal. They see a viable office. This buyer has gone in and said, I like this office because of these reasons. And maybe they've had great advisors encouraging them to do it. But then I guess the big question is what's happening once they take ownership? Why are they not growing it the way that they said that they would? You know, what's not happening in there? And again, you know, I have seen some of those cases where they've come back 2 years later and they're really hurting because they overpaid. They got a very low interest rate. They got 2 years interest only. So I don't think there's anything wrong with the 100% financing if it makes sense for that particular acquisition.
Yeah, I agree. I agree with Jackie. I don't think there's anything wrong with it. Historically, you know, dentistry is always done well. People don't really close their clinics. Um, they don't go into bankruptcy or anything. So, from a bank's perspective, it makes complete sense to lend to someone that's, you know, that's relatively a safe investment. So, as a buyer, obviously it's great because you're getting 100% financing or maybe sometimes even more, as Jackie mentioned, but it does increase the prices, obviously, because that makes a lot more people eligible. So, especially when I think when people they're not necessarily abusing it, they're just taking advantage of it, is when, you know, you're buying 5, 10, 15 clinics.
Yes.
That's when it becomes, I
That's when
think,
it's
over the
ridiculous.
top. Yeah. So that
Yeah.
I think it's great if you're, you know, a 1-2 practice owner, but when you're competing against people that are buying 5, 10, 15, that's when it gets a little frustrating as like a first time or second time buyer, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
But from my conversation with banks recently, I find that they have become a little bit more strict. I don't know from you
Yep.
guys' perspective.
Yep.
They are asking for a lot more information. They do, I think some banks are starting to kind of check up on you annually and kind of seeing where you're headed and what's happening and why you're not maybe, paying back what you're supposed to be paying back.
I kind of like to say, sorry to interrupt you, but I kind of like to say the bankers are doing their jobs.
Yeah,
Because when
yeah,
I was a
exactly.
banker, we did do that kind of check to make sure, like, listen, when we first came out with the program, I thought we'd lost our minds at a bank. I had just come out of a stint in the bad loan department where you literally trust nobody, including your own grandmother, to lend her $5. But, once I learned the value of the license and the ability to create wealth from it, okay, that made sense. And even now, as much as the economy has turned, the default rate on these loans are still so small. They're so hard to track compared to some other industries, right? But bankers are doing their jobs, which is what they should have been doing from the beginning. They should have understood who the buyer was. They should have looked to see, okay, are they the best? Like, are they equipped to take this type of challenge on? What's their fallback if they can't take money from this office? Like, there's so many things that should really go into the thought process of somebody when they're buying. And they should be checking up on them, because it's always easy to throw money out. It's very tough to try to bring it back in.
If I could play devil's advocate here, and again, I'm not saying anything against the banks. I worked at the bank for a long time. I deal with banks every single day. As we were sitting here, I probably had 4 or 5 approvals come in from like TD and Scotia. So I'm like literally in business
And
with
some of
banks
my
all the
best
time.
friends are bankers still.
Yeah, but if I could play devil's advocate, I feel like just because a business doesn't go out of, like just because dentists don't go bankrupt when they're running a clinic, I personally feel like that's not a good enough reason to give them 100% financing, because what it does is it just boosts the price up. And then what's tough for dentists, because I'm talking to them every day, is that while, yes, you're not going bankrupt, are you as profitable as you'd like to be? Do you have the lifestyle you want? I think the elephant in the room here is that dentists are more burnt out and depressed than ever. Whether they run a clinic or they're an associate, that onus has been put on everyone because the clinic is that much more expensive. We have to produce this much more. And I'm not saying the banks are to blame for this, but I do think there's a bit of like irrational exuberance of anytime I see that we're just giving money frivolously to like anyone, I always get a bit scared. I've seen it happen in the real estate side of things because, when interest rates are really low, people are buying houses for 1.5, and those same banks were giving you that mortgage. And now when you're going to refinance that thing, they're not giving you the finances for it.
For sure.
So they're checking up on you to make sure that you're going to pay them. Not because they care about you. They don't care about what your daughter's name is and the fact that you're working 80 hours a week. That's not why. They're doing it so that you pay them. And so I feel like I'm not saying banks are bad. That's really not what I'm saying.
No,
I feel like it's the 100% financing. While it's great, it has its pros. It definitely has its cons. And I think the cons are that it's led to very high pricing. It's led to everyone buying clinics for more. Meanwhile, they have to produce more. Meanwhile, like it has this knock-on effect or ripple effect that just isn't talked about. But it's patched up with, well, no one goes bankrupt as a dentist because dentists work hard.
Yeah.
I don't think they'd have the pride to go bankrupt.
No.
These are diligent people who strive for excellence. They'll just work more instead of go bankrupt.
Whenever I've seen a practice fail, it's not the practice, it's the practitioner. And it's not because they couldn't do dentistry. It was because they had an addiction. They've gone through a couple of divorces. They've decided to invest in a restaurant, which they know nothing about. Like people make crazy investments, but I don't know. Like, I think part of this whole feeling of value is also stemming from the fact that buyers want to stay in the most populated cities in Canada. Like, I even did a webinar where I showed people, here's a practice 2 hours from Toronto. Here's one right in Toronto. The practice 2 hours away had a net profit of 60%. Net profit. And the other one had a 20% net profit. So, the one that was 2 hours away, basically Monday to Thursday, 9 to 5, no Fridays, no Saturdays, making a good living. And those are people want to stay in the big city.
And I think that's a positive point to leave off at.
Thank you so much, Jackie, for spending the time and sharing your experience and wisdom on dental practice sales with us. With many of our listeners looking into buying their first practice or moving into multi-practice ownership, I'm sure they've gained valuable points from this episode. Don't forget to tune in next time for more discussions and insights that can help you navigate your dental journey.